should I do?
If I can't hear it from here.
Would you please give me more feedback on how you can't hear? Testing. Brian Gamble, can you hear me all right? Brian, Donna, Blair, Todd Ferguson, loud and clear. Welcome to week 3 of Theology on Tap. That was tepid. I will accept it. We're so glad that you are here for this series on the problem of evil. We've called it God's Problem, obviously, because this is the thing. From youth groups to college dorm rooms to pastors' offices, when people come back to church after 30 years in the wilderness, there's always this question. Why is there evil in the world? If God is good, how can it be present? And also, this thing once happened to me or to somebody I love. And how do we reconcile all that? So we've now addressed it over the past 2 weeks, and over the next 2 weeks, we will finally solve it. So all you have to do, Elise, so we've covered 50%. You got to get to the 75%, and then the last 25% will finish in week 4. I'm so excited to welcome you tonight. If you are a guest with us, we're so glad that you're here. St. Alban's is an Episcopal church, which means we worship Oprah Winfrey. And our beliefs are very similar to Scientology. If you'd like to know more, please talk to Jerry Campbell. He's there in the back, and he can answer all your questions. Seriously, though, if you are looking for a church home, we'd love to talk to you about what that means at a place like St. Albans and in the Episcopal Church. As we continue this evening, you're going to hear from Dr. Elise Edwards, and then at the end of her talk, we'll have a time for questions. If you have a question while she's talking, if your brain is like mine, you will forget it. So that's what the pieces of paper, those note cards, are on the table for, if you want to write it down. And then if you're the kind of person that doesn't like to make your voice heard in public, you can then pass those cards to the front if you want us to just read your question and have it addressed that way. Or at the end, you can just put up a hand and we'll give you a chance to ask your question. So I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Elise Edwards. She has spoken at Sunday school at St. Albans in the past, so she may be familiar to some of you. She's an assistant professor at Baylor University. She has a career that combines architecture, ethics, religion, all kinds of things. There's a big word called intersectional, and if you look it up, it shows Elise's picture. So she is going to talk. I will not waste any more of her time, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you, and I ask you for a warm welcome for Dr. Elise Edwards.
Thank you. I am really happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this series on bad things, good people, and the persistence of evil. I feel kind of like, so I'm a fan of pop culture, and every year they have the Met Gala, right? And Twitter afterwards says whether or not people understood the assignment, right? Whether they dressed appropriately. I feel like I'm a little bit on the bubble here, right? I understood the assignment that we're talking about theodicy and this question of why does God permit evil, but I came at it at a different angle. So theodicy is one of those great questions that philosophers and theologians wrestle with. I've been thinking through this since my time in graduate school, and it's really problematized for me, so I don't have an answer for it. I don't have an answer to why there's evil and suffering in the world or why bad things happen to good people. One of my friends sent me an email in response to inviting her to join us here, and she's like, oh, if you can tell me why bad things happen to good people, that would be really great. I said, yeah, I wish I could do that in an email, but I'm not quite that skilled. I do know that bad things happen to everyone, though. So there is a sense in which we are all in the same boat. In Matthew chapter 5, after the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells his followers to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. And then he goes on to say, for God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. So this is what I wrestle with, and what this is the only answer I have, right? Is that we live in a world where the rain falls on the good and the evil alike. God's economy of grace and the troubles of a fallen world overlap in our time, and we experience both. We experience the blessings, we experience the hardship. Some of us experience more hardship than we earn or deserve, but I'm certain all of us experience more blessings than we deserve. So that's how I live with this question of evil. I don't have a sophisticated answer for why this is, so this evening I want to approach the topic of evil from a different angle, which is how we survive or even flourish in the midst of evil. More specifically, I want to talk about what our task is as Christians in the face of evil, and more specifically in the conflict that occurs when we try to address injustice. So over the past few years, I've been exploring these questions in my academic writing, in my classes. I teach classes in Christian ethics and theology and feminist theology at Baylor. And I've been exploring these topics even in churches, especially as we've discussed racism and division and questions about belonging. In a way, this conversation that we're having tonight really started with informal conversations about belonging and the intense heartache and frustration I hear from many people who feel that they're caught in the middle of complex debates in their families, in their churches, and in their workplaces. They don't feel comfortable talking about their sense of being in the middle to many people, but they'll share it with me. My friends, these confidants of mine, will say that they want to be on the right side, and I truly believe them. They want to be on the right side, but they have some questions about what the other side is saying, or what their side is saying, right? So they can't wholeheartedly endorse what they know they're supposed to endorse, or what they're expected to endorse, even though they actually mostly agree with it. So let me give you an example if I lost you, right? So in these private conversations, these people will say to me, I truly believe that Black Lives Matter, yet I have concerns about Black Lives Matter as a movement, and I'm afraid to admit that. Then they might even say, please still be my friend after this conversation, right? And I'm like, of course I'll be your friend. Let's talk about that, right? Another person might say, I want my workplace to be more diverse, yet I think my coworkers are going about it the wrong way. Or someone very close to me says, I'm happy that you got the COVID vaccine, speaking to me, right? I'm happy you got the COVID vaccine, and I'm really glad that it's made you comfortable socializing again and being around people. But I still have my reservations about it, and I don't plan to get it. Right. It's common to cast stances on Black Lives Matter in one of two camps. You're either racist or you're anti-racist. And it's common to hear people speak of our responses to COVID as either pro-vaccine or anti-vaxxer. And while these terms can be legitimately used in some contexts, I don't think they're very helpful when they represent the totality of positions. So there are people who firmly associate themselves in one of those camps, but there are many people who are somewhere in the middle and who can see arguments on what we might call both sides. So what we're doing when we use those terms very often is we're reducing what is a spectrum of positions to two diametrically opposed poles. that stand in opposition for each other, opposition with each other. So tonight, what I'm presenting to you is this idea that I have, that in a time of social change and division, when all of us are just trying to wrap our minds around the many changes that we're coping with, Christians especially have to resist this temptation to oversimplify complex moral problems like racism, like response to COVID, like diversity in the workplace. We have to resist reducing our stances on those issues to dualistic frameworks. That is, frameworks that state you're either right or you're wrong, positions like us versus them, for or against, or even good versus evil. I argue that while we should be committed to ending racism, to ensuring public health, and promoting the common good, I'm for all of those things. Too often, we ignore or gloss over complexities around these issues. And in the process of that, we increase polarization. So as an alternative to dualistic frameworks, I propose that we attempt to understand contemporary moral issues as wicked problems. An understanding of wicked problems could help us navigate conflict in a way that is truthful, that's honest about what's happening, a way that's empathetic, that's intersectional. I'm so glad that was part of my introduction. And that's invitational, that invites people in. This framework of wicked problems also opens us up to seek solutions that go beyond typical forms of public discourse, which is usually just yelling at each other or hearing sound bites on TV or forwarding things that come across our social media feed. I think we can do better than that. And part of what I think we can develop is artistic responses that really explore ambiguity, and that we can develop other responses that are more nuanced. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to explain why reducing contemporary moral problems to dualistic frameworks is a problem, why adopting an understanding of wicked problems offers a solution, and how we might go about addressing conflict in a productive and, dare I say, Christian way. So that's where we're going this evening. So let me start off with the problem. So I'm an ethicist. We like to state the problem and then state a solution for it and then add some more comments in there. So let's start with the understanding of the problem. And as you can see, there are actually two problems I'm going to discuss here. So we have two interrelated problems with the contemporary ways that we engage moral issues. The first is that we have dualistic conceptions of moral issues. And the second is that we often turn to single-axis thinking as a way to find solutions. So I'll talk about what both of those are. So dualism, many of you already know this, but I want to make sure we all are working with the same terms here. Dualism is a theory or a system that recognizes two independent principles. But especially as we use it in the phrase dualistic thinking, right? Or we're critiquing the construction of dualisms. We're addressing the idea or the teaching, the framework, the concept of understanding, the paradigm, if you will, that there are two independent principles that are good and evil. So this is saying that good and evil are two separate things. I spend a lot of time researching feminist methodologies and womanist methodologies in ethics. And concerns about dualisms emerge from those types of theology. Because what authors have said is that in patriarchy or in patriarchal systems, two halves that are related to each other are very often framed as superior and inferior, right? So the obvious example there is male-female. that feminists are critiquing. This posits that these are two separate things, right? When really we're all human, right? And also posits that there's nothing in between, right? So we have two options, male, female, and one is superior and one is inferior. So typically the one we state first is the one that's presumably superior. So just notice that whenever you start describing things in terms of twos, pay attention to which one you're saying first, and then see if you want to switch those around and whether it makes a difference to how you're understanding it. It's very subtle, but we do it all the time. So concerns about dualism are part of this strand of feminist theology. And associated with this, we also have concerns about like strong, active terms being associated with men and passive, weak, dependent traits being associated with women. So we have a concern coming out of feminist theology. But there's also a concern in modern thinkers within the church, like Richard Rohr and Cynthia Bourgeois, who, as well as a longer tradition of mysticism that strives to overcome dualism. Because the idea is that at some level, we want to achieve a consciousness that emphasizes our connection with other things rather than our separation from them. So mystics, of course, are seeking union with God, right? We know that we're separate, but if the Spirit lives within us, then maybe there's a way in which we're actually not very separate, right? So it's about understanding that interconnectedness instead of this dualistic framework. And in fact, most of the really difficult Christian questions and Christian doctrines can't be understood in dualistic frameworks. Things like the incarnation, right? How can Jesus be both fully human and fully God at the same time? It doesn't work in dualistic frameworks. And the church has told us, no, it's not that he's half human and half God, right? As if there's some dividing line in the middle, right? And not just the incarnation, but the nature of free will versus liberty, right? That these things are two separate things. Or God's sovereignty and human agency, that these are two separate ends of a spectrum. In all of our really important and thorny Christian doctrines, these things have to be held together in tension. And so to really understand Christianity, we have to find a way past dualistic thinking. It's often our starting point, but as we mature, we have to find a way to get beyond the dualisms. So when it comes to contemporary social issues, dualism is a problem for several reasons. First is that it oversimplifies complex issues. If things really were very simple, we would have solved them already, right? So consider the abortion debate. Yeah, I'm going there. In political discourse, we've oversimplified abortion to be a debate about the legality of abortion, right? As if abortion goes away when it's illegal, or as if women's bodily rights, the lives of children, and the hardships created by crisis pregnancies go away when abortion is legal. History shows us that's not the case, right? There are many issues related to abortion that have nothing to do with legality. And there are issues that do have to do with legality, right? But we can't simplify this complex issue or reduce this complex issue to a question of legality. So while we can, and I would argue should, continue to follow our moral dictates in our political battles over abortion's legality, we can't think that the issue is covered by such a narrow sphere. Instead, we might ask questions like, what are our moral obligations to women, to their families, to their partners, before, during, and after a woman considers abortion? That's a really hard question, and not one that can be answered by questions about legality, right? What are our obligations before, during, and after a woman considers abortion? What does it mean to offer grace and compassion to a woman in a crisis pregnancy? Whether she miscarries, whether she seeks an abortion, whether she carries the child to term and is faced with the realities of adoption, the realities of raising a child, the realities of relinquishing a child to foster care, the realities of raising a child who has severe physical limitations. None of that is solved by the question of legality. When someone actually whether someone actually chooses to go through with an abortion or not, considering it, even for a brief moment, indicates that this is a deeper issue, right? Because we have people who have said, I would never consider that, and then they find themselves in a crisis pregnancy. And it says, oh, well, this is more complex than what I thought it was, right? Even if ultimately they say, oh, well, I can't really go through with that. It points to the fact that the issue is a lot more complex than we think it is. So dualistic thinking oversimplifies complex issues. Dualistic thinking also oversimplifies the kinds of responses we can have to a social problem. So in my work as an ethicist, I'm used to assigning work for my students to read. Most of the time they do the readings, right? I assign usually about 4 to 5 short essays about a topic like abortion. And what's interesting is that I have them state the thesis of all of these essays that I've assigned them to make sure they understand it. The thesis is the main argument, right? Do you understand what the author is saying? And the interesting thing is all of the thesis statements are addressing slightly different solutions or slightly different responses to the problem. They're not all about the same thing. And so when we restrict ourselves to dualistic frameworks, we limit ourselves to responses that are very narrow as well. Dualistic thinking also vilifies our opponents and reinforces hierarchies. So going back to the idea that if these issues are simple, right, if we're presuming that these issues are very simple, then it's easy to say, well, then anyone who disagrees with me is just stupid, right? Because it's easy, right? This is so obvious, right? Or, even worse, anyone who disagrees with me is evil, right? More commonly, we say anyone who disagrees with me is wrong, right? But that's vilifying our opponents, and it's also setting up a hierarchy in which we see ourselves as smarter, morally good, better than they are, or, just right. and right is always better than wrong, right? And then finally, because of this, because we've created these hierarchies and we've vilified our opponents, dualistic thinking increases alienation and separation. We say, I'm not like my opponents, those stupid, evil people, right? And I don't even want to be around them, right? They're getting on my nerves. They're just dumb. I can't be around that. They're going to kill off my brain cells, right? So we can easily fall into that kind of divisiveness, and many of us are familiar with that in our social context and in the current political scene. But it also causes another kind of alienation, the kind I hinted at earlier, of people who don't think they fit into either side. So they say, where do I belong? Or worse, do I belong? Right? Do I belong in this institution? Do I belong in this church? Everyone seems to have their clear positions. Where do I fit? And so I hear from Christians who are really smart, who are really good critical thinkers, who are really sensitive to the rejection and the exclusion that they could possibly face if they admit some of these concerns that they have about the positions they know they're supposed to adopt. And I don't think that helps any of us. We want our smart, sensitive, nuanced Christian thinkers to help us solve problems, not to hide in the shadows. So very quickly, I'll say a little bit about single-axis thinking. Oh, let me say here. Okay, so a little more about dualism. Let's turn this here. So I'm not, to be clear, lapsing into something like moral relativism, where we say every solution is fine. No one becomes a Christian ethicist because we think everything's fine, right? And every position is equally valid. That's not what we do, right? But what I'm saying is the way we think about good and evil is usually with this dividing line, this framework, right? That there are two sides, good versus evil. Or we might think of it this way, right? Good is confronting evil. Two sides that are meeting in conflict. But I would argue more often than not, when we're talking about issues like racism, public health, abortion, diversity, right? There's a whole spectrum of responses. For instance, if we map on, let's say, anti-racist onto the good side and racist onto the evil side, right? Because no one's going to say, yay, racism is great, right? So if we do that, we can imagine there's a space in the middle where people are both racist and anti-racist. I can say I am both racist and anti-racist. In my classroom, I am anti-racist. And yet there are internalized forms of racism that I uncover the more spiritual work I do. Things I didn't even know I thought about myself and my community that are embedded in my thoughts. I've made assumptions about other people based on unconscious bias, which is another way we can be both racist and anti-racist, right? So these things overlap, even when we're taking something that seems clear-cut, like don't be a racist, right? It's actually much more nuanced than that. And so we have to resist thinking that there's that dividing line. But instead, very often, that middle area is the overlapping of both. Okay, so now I want to say a little bit about single-axis thinking and why this is a problem. This is also called monofocus, and it's a danger when we move from dualism to multiple options. So when we start interrogating binaries and dualisms, especially when we're committed to examining diverse positions and identities, we can narrow our thinking when it comes to solutions. So in social justice work, we find what Vivian May refers to as gender-first or race-first approaches that give priority to one facet of identity as explanatory for experiences of oppression, right? So it's because of my race that this person has treated me this way. Or saying, if we're going to address diversity, we really need to focus on religious diversity first, right? Rather than some other aspect or multiple aspects at the same time. So that would be single axis thinking, when we prioritize one piece of that complex puzzle first, right? It reduces the type of solutions we can arrive at, and it reduces the very understanding of identity as either or instead of both and, which is what we're trying to get to. We already covered that, right? So single axis thinking has many of the same issues as dualistic thinking. But more particularly, it exacerbates inequalities by overlooking differences in experience and impact. So we might say something like, this abortion policy is good for women. Which women? What kind of women, right? Because is this something that's going to help poor women, wealthy women, white women, women of color, married women, single women, employed women, unemployed women, right? Who are we talking about when we have these single categories, right? We're overlooking differences in experience and also in the impact of what we're suggesting, of our solutions. It also oversimplifies our understanding of identity by placing people in neat categories. So what if there are more than one, right? What if you are, a woman of color or a person of color and a woman, right? You don't want to choose which one you want to advocate for because you're both, and I speak from personal experience here, right? It also tends to propose all or nothing solutions. And that goes back to the idea of hierarchies and vilifying our opponents, right? Well, if you're not on my team here, then we're just not making any progress, right? We got to do this because this is really going to move the needle, right? It's all or nothing thinking. And then finally, it masks in-group inequities while focusing on inequities across groups. So differences in power exist within these groups, even when we're trying to work for the same thing. So we want to move from single-axis approaches to intersectional ones. So I'll say a little more about that, but let me get to the heart of what I'm proposing here, which is the idea of wicked problems. So how do we avoid dualistic and single-axis thinking? Well, I suggest that one response is to frame our understanding of issues as wicked problems. I first encountered the idea of wicked problems when I was in architecture school. I was an undergraduate student studying architecture. One of my professors explained that design is a wicked problem. And anyone who's done a renovation, like perhaps a kitchen renovation, you know this is true, right? Design is a wicked problem. Because a design problem, when we're doing something like making a kitchen work better, or you all just had a new building, right? Yeah. You know that these aren't the kinds of problems that have simple solutions. In other words, there's not just one solution, right? These aren't yes or no questions. And figuring out the best response involves balancing different needs and desires that are important to different degrees. Furthermore, design isn't the kind of problem that has a clear end. So anyone who does any kind of creative work in any capacity knows this, right? There's a time when you just have to stop, right? Additional refinements can always be made. That poem you're writing can always be better. That painting could always have another touch-up, right? But eventually you have to stop, right? That's the kind of problem that I'm saying most contemporary moral issues are. In moral reflection, wickedness is a moral term related to evil. So in ethical reflection, if we're talking about wicked problems, this has to do with the type of evil or harm that can be remedied. So up on the screen, I have a quote by Mary Potter Engel. She has an essay called Evil, Sin, and the Violation of the Vulnerable. And in this, she says, evil and sin together may be called wickedness, the complex condition of the lack of right relations in the world in which we live naturally, socially, and individually. So wickedness is a part of this world that we live in, right? That's not news to any of you. Though they are inseparable, evil and sin, it is important to distinguish between the two. Evil, as Latin American liberation theology has taught us, is systemic. It is not superpersonal forces, but structures of oppression, patterns larger than individuals and groups that tempt us toward injustice and impiety. It is social, political, and economic arrangements that distort our perceptions or restrain our abilities to such an extent that we find it difficult to choose or to do good. By contrast, sin refers to those free, discrete acts of responsible individuals that create or reinforce these structures of oppression. Neither causes the other. Evil and sin are mutually reinforcing. So there's a lot in this quote I could unpack, but what I want to suggest here is that when we address wickedness, we have to resist highlighting only the personal side, what she's calling sin, and also fight against the tendency to externalize evil, right? Make evil something outside of ourselves, to such an extent that each individual is exempt from all responsibility for accountability to it, right? Evil exists in the world. I can't control everything out there. I can only control myself, so I'm not responsible for that. That's what I'm saying. We have to resist that way of thinking. So if we can understand our contemporary social problems as wicked problems, we have to address both the systemic evil and the personal shortcomings. And I'll just give a brief example here. The person who refuses a COVID vaccine doesn't arrive at the decision from what we might call in this language personal shortcomings alone, right? A person who's healthy and able to get the vaccine but chooses not to. That decision is typically made in a context in which social trust has eroded to such a degree that the so-called anti-vaxxer does not trust pharmaceutical companies, or they don't trust large media corporations, or they don't trust politicians. We are forsaking honesty for political expediency if we pretend that pharmaceutical companies, large media corporations, and politicians are completely trustworthy. They are not. We know that. And yet, if we ignore the whole question of social trust and place it just on the individual decision, we lose the complexity of this issue. Now, we still might decide that vaccines are a good thing. We might frame the decision not to vaccinate as something that needs both personal and systemic issues. We might argue that there are merits to COVID vaccine mandates and all of that. But in our solution, we still have to find a way of addressing that problem of social trust if we're going to arrive at a real solution. Because otherwise, if we just force everybody to get a vaccine, right, when they already don't trust the politicians who would be the ones telling them that now they have to do this, we further increased the division and we further eroded the very thin layer of social trust that might still be there. So what I'm saying is we have to learn to deal with the tensions around an issue if we have any hope of solving it. So the last thing I want to say about wicked problems, and then we can get to some of the practical solutions in the Q&A, is that wicked problems, this whole idea of wicked problems, first emerged in literature about design thinking. So I mentioned I first heard the phrase as an architecture student. And it was in the 1960s, Horst Rittel, who is a mathematician, a designer, and an educator, argued that design processes aren't linear progressions that follow a step-by-step model of problem definition and solution. The model I like, right? Where we say, here's the problem, here's the solution. He says that actually doesn't work for most kinds of our problems. So now I say, here's the problem, here's a solution, right? But instead, he says these are wicked problems. And we can apply these to social problems, not just design problems. Rittel describes these wicked problems as a class of social system problems which are ill-formulated, not meaning bad intended, right? But that they're just hard to formulate, where information is confusing, where there are many clients and decision makers with conflicting values, and where the ramifications in the whole system are thoroughly confusing. I think this explains most social issues that we have today, right? The problems themselves are hard to define. Take an issue like immigration, right? can we agree on a single question of what the problem, or a single definition of what the problem is? No, we can have, I can think of 10 different ways of phrasing the problem off the top of my head, right? Information is confusing, right? Who do we trust? Where are we getting our information from? There are many different stakeholders, many different decision makers with conflicting values, and the ramifications for the whole system are thoroughly confusing. We don't know what the outcomes are going to be for all of the decisions we propose to make, right? So I argue that we need to understand social problems in this way rather than in dualistic or binary or single axis ways of thinking. So we can start our Q&A. I'm going to put up on the screen some of the practical applications. I will say one other thing is that this type of move from single axis thinking to more complex thinking involves a move to intersectionality. Which I have up on the screen, which is considering not that these are all separate issues, but these are all interlocking issues that magnify each other. So I like the issue of waves, right? The idea that you've seen water with waves, right? Where one wave catches up to the other, and then it becomes a bigger wave, right? That's what these interlocking oppressions are like. They tend to magnify the more they get compounded with each other, right? What this kind of analysis forces us to do is recognize that our power is always variable, right? So we may be powerful in one context and not powerful in another based on how these different identities and factors of our social location overlap. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.
One of the things I love about Theology on Tap is that we talk about really hard, complex things. We're crazy enough to actually bring these things up. I think we do it in a bar just so that there's security here who can break up any fights that happen. And honestly, if we as Christians are not willing to have these conversations, why have opinions and beliefs about anything? There are few things as important as the issues you have brought up tonight, and yet we're all terrified to talk about them. So thank you for going there. Thank you for being here with us, and thank you for helping us complexify these situations. So we've got a question. Who is good or evil, the Beatles or the Rolling Stones? Just kidding. The question is, and the Beatles are good and the Stones are evil. That's the answer to that question.
That's what I would
Thank you. But almost all the Stones are still alive, so who knows? Why God?
The rain, God causes the rain.
I know, the rain falls on the good and the evil, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, George Harrison and Mick Jagger. What changes when dealing with one-on-one versus large groups? And you can take that any way you like.
Yeah. I think it's actually a little easier to be honest in one-on-one settings, right? So this is where those friends have said those things to me that are difficult to admit in large groups. One-on-one, we can have two things that can happen, right? Or it's that binary thinking again. We can have multiple outcomes, right? But in one-on-one situations where we have established relationships of love or trust or respect, there's a sense in which we can challenge ourselves to be more vulnerable and real and honest, right? So many of us find, hopefully, we find we're able to be honest with our partners or our best friends, right? Especially when you have that, you've made that commitment, right? we're going to be friends forever. I have a friend who says to me all the time, we're going to be old ladies in rocking chairs, together. And there's a sense in which I think we can have difficult conversations, and we do because we're already committed to remaining friends, right? One-on-one conversations can be much more challenging when there are deep disagreements, right? And you all know this, right? So when you have someone you love intensely and you are deeply divided on an issue. But I think that's where it's almost easier to remember that you do love them and you empathize with them and you see them as a whole person, not just their stance on this one issue, right? And so you can say, ooh, I really want to strangle you on the way you think about this, but we're not going to be irreconcilable because of it, right? There's a whole host of other things that make us bonded to each other. And I think actually that's the way churches are supposed to work, right? We can deeply disagree about things, and yet we are still in church together. I know there's someone I go to church with, I was in the choir with, and I was like, ooh, they really set my blood boiling on the way they talk about these things. And yet, I had to see them every Wednesday. And I was like, I do think there's something we have in common, right? I know there's a lot we have in common, right? And eventually I was able to move past that, right? So that one-on-one thing, it can either be a cause for painful rejection, right? Or it can be a context in which we can really see people as their full selves. That's harder to do in large groups, but you can in large groups do exercises that promote empathy, that promote thinking from the other side, the other side, right? I was just in a workshop earlier today where we did an exercise like this that was pretty low stakes, but it was interesting how you begin to see other people's point of view and think, okay, that makes sense. I can understand where they're coming from even if I don't agree with them. So it can work in large groups too, but we have to do things that really promote empathy rather than mob mentality in large groups. And that's where I think some arts responses come in, when we can do storytelling and role play, when we can watch a film and have discussions over it. Or I know you've read books and things and had discussions over books and that kind of thing. That, I think, leads us in large groups to better ways of thinking than dualistic. So that's a long answer.
Thank you. Next question. Recently, trans actress and activist Laverne Cox said, quote, "For you, it's culture wars. For me, it's life or death." How do we live/respond when it feels like we can't leave our quote-unquote camp, our quote-unquote side of these debates? So trans actress and activist Laverne Cox said, "For you, it's culture wars. For me, it's life or death." How do we live or respond when it feels like we can't leave our camp?
Yeah, so, I mean, Laverne Cox represents a lot of these things that we often talk about when we're talking about intersectionality, right? She's a black trans woman. She is in the public eye, but is challenging what she thinks she owes the public in terms of expectations about her body and her life and all of her experiences. So sometimes she shares, sometimes she doesn't, right? What she's saying, what I gather in that quote, is that she's saying for her, questions about being trans aren't culture wars because they have to do with who she is. She and many other trans black women and trans black men are at higher risk for physical violence. It's life or death, right? Things that some of us can take for granted, not all of us can take for granted, walking down the street with a presumption of safety. She may or may not have that. she's well known, right? She's in the public eye, so she's recognizable. I presume some degree of wealth that goes along with that, which gives her more safety than others who don't have that. And yet she's still very vulnerable to these same forces. So the question of how do we, can you read the last part of the question again?
How do we live or respond when it feels like we can't leave our camp? Meaning, I guess, take that how you want.
So how do we respond? We have to try our best to remember that for many of the things that we consider issues, these are the things that are consuming people's lives, right? That these issues for us may be abstract, but that these are always real. And so when we're trying to figure out solutions, we have to talk to or get the experiences from, read about, watch films, listen to interviews about people who represent that issue, who are in it. In my class, we talk about this as epistemological privilege, meaning we give the loudest voice in the room to the person who's experiencing it. And we learn from there, because it really matters. All of these issues in the world really matter to some people more than others. And most of the time, we're more passionate about an issue because it touches our lives in some kind of way. And that's a valid way of knowing and learning, right? So we have to make the effort to get out of our own camp, right? We have to seek out those interviews, books, podcasts, the things that will give us access to the people who are willing to share their experiences so that we can move beyond our narrow ways of thinking. And I'm not saying narrow-minded, right? It's just we all have limitations on what we know until we go beyond that and try to expand it.
Questions? Further questions? Yes, Anna Beaudry. If that is your real name.
So, let's say I want to think more like this, because I do. I'm not good at it, but I do. But I'm talking to someone who's perhaps more resistant than I am to think this way.
Yeah.
What are ways to engage and find common ground when there's resistance?
So, just to repeat the question, Anna has asked, when she is talking to people who do not share this perspective on intersectionality of trying to understand all the different dynamics of power and different experiences, when you're talking to people, you try to have these understanding issues are complex and not dualistic, but you're talking to somebody who's very much in a dualistic, there's a right and a wrong and a black and a white and a good and an evil. How do you engage with somebody who has that perspective? Is that a fair summary of your question? All right.
Can you click back to one or two slides? So I think one of the things we can do is start asking questions that move us beyond the binaries, right? So a question like, okay, I understand these are two different sides. Are there other options or other voices we're not thinking of that represent other ways of looking at this, right? So ask that with real curiosity, right? Ask that of yourself, ask that of the person you're with. Don't use it just as a technique. Are there people we're not thinking of in this conversation, right? We know people who do that with their smug voice, right? They already know the answer they're seeking and they ask that. Don't be that jerk. Ask sincerely, are there other points of view that we're not thinking of? It seems like we've narrowed in on two different points of view. That's helpful. But are there other points of view that maybe we're not looking at, right? So that's one thing. The other thing, if you run into someone who is just dead set on good versus evil, right? And I encounter people like this even in my classroom, right? I move to a different type of question. So the question up there, the second one under ask, what does it mean to be compassionate to people who are suffering in this situation? Right? So whether we're talking about immigration, whether we're talking about abortion, whether we're talking about COVID. What does it mean to be compassionate to ones who are suffering? There's a story I read recently. I tear up when I think about it. I don't know why this touches me so much, but I read a story about people who have loved ones who are dying of COVID, and how they are hiding the reasons, the reason of death, the cause of death, in their death announcements. Because if they say the person died from COVID, they get a lot of response on social media immediately asking, were they vaccinated? Why not? I can't think of a worse response when a loved one has just died for you to say, well, were they vaccinated? Why not, right? And then berate them for their loved one's death. In the article, I was reading about this, it said the last time this happened on such a major scale was during the AIDS epidemic, where people had to hide, their cause of death, because then people would ask questions about, well, were they using safe sex practices? Were they engaging in illicit drug use or homosexual activity? All of these personal reasons that they could use to then blame the person for their own death. Not only does it fail to address the suffering of the person who died, right? I mean, there's that, right? That someone suffered and died, right? We're losing sight of that. But then there's also the loved ones who can't even grieve properly at a time when they need people around them to help them process what has happened, right? And so if we pause for a moment and say, okay, we're entrenched on these different sides, but we ask a better question like, what does it mean to be compassionate to people who are suffering here? Then maybe we can arrive at something closer to a Christian response than asking someone if they were vaccinated.
So one place where good and evil has come up recently in public is the Super Bowl halftime performance. This is an artistic display of Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre, 50 Cent, Eminem, and Mary J. Blige. And who did I forget someone? And Kendrick Lamar, the Pulitzer Prize winning Kendrick Lamar. There were a lot of people who were deeply offended and took to social media to call it evil and wrong, and it was not just, this is not my favorite kind of music. It was like this deep, visceral response. Somebody said that they would much rather hear a halftime show every year of Lee Greenwood and Kid Rock. Why do people take something like an artistic performance and turn it into a dualistic right and wrong? And what kind of questions could we ask to complexify this question?
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, I think we ask, what is it that Lee Greenwood and Kid Rock represent for us? And what is it that Kendrick Lamar and Mary J. Blige, the great Mary J. Blige, and Snoop Dogg and Dre, what do they represent? Oh, and 50 Cent. What do they represent for us, right? And so the question is, what's being evoked that is so problematic, right? And then we can have discussions about that and see if people really will be honest with their answers, right? So it could be, this represents a kind of like thug life that I want no part in, right? That's one answer, right? I don't think it's the real reason, but it's one answer somebody could give, right? And then you ask questions about that. Well, is all of their music this glorification of these things? Or are there more interesting, or are there more subtle, nuanced readings of this we can have, even taking the work at face value, right? So we don't even have to dive very deep into Kendrick Lamar's work to know that he's talking about something more than this kind of, thing we might oppose, right, as glorification of violence. So I think the initial question is, what is it we're responding so negatively to? What is it that this artwork represents for us or evokes in us that has us so threatened or angry or frightened. And then we can get to some real questions. I think, personally, art needs to provoke us into asking those kinds of questions, right? And that's the beauty of art that seems just like easy entertainment, right? Next thing you know, we're pondering stuff we never thought we'd ponder, right?
Why are we okay with Motley Crue and Kiss and their
Right.
misogyny and glorification of substance abuse,
Right.
and not in these art? Why?
Right.
Yeah. So
Right.
who gets a
So
pass
ask
and who
the
doesn't?
Questions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we ask the questions, right? Why are we upset about this when this person's doing it and not that person's doing it? And press for an honest response and see where the conversation goes. There are many venues where you're not going to get those kinds of honest responses and deep dialogue. So one of the other things I have on here is use existing models of dialogue. There are all kinds of strategies for engaging in real substantive dialogue with other people. Some of us know about public deliberation as a model of dialogue. There are forms of nonviolent conflict resolution that promote dialogue, intergroup dialogue. There are numerous models out there for actually having difficult conversations. We can study those and implement those in our lives, but almost all of them begin with asking better questions that transcend these limitations that we've already placed.
Well, it will bring us to the end of our third week of Theology on Tap. We want to respect your time. We want to also thank Guest Barbecue for hosting us. If anybody here is, we're glad you're here. Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Rachel Toombs, who did all the legwork to get this set up, and to all the volunteers, John White and others who helped to set this up. Thank you for being part of that. And most of all, thank you to Dr. Edwards for being here tonight. We're so grateful. We invite you to return next week for our fourth and final installment of this year's Theology on Tap. And we look forward to seeing you again next week with Dr. Hilary Yancey, philosopher and writer, talking about the challenging assumptions about the nature of evil, insights from the philosophy of disability. So, see you next week.